You're listening to the Jam Pray Show, all about movies. And today, my guest is author Alonso Duralde. And we're going to be talking about this really interesting, fascinating book that he just wrote entitled Hollywood Pride. Welcome to the show, Alonso.
Oh, thank you, and thanks for having me.
Oh, you're welcome. This is, yeah, the research on this book must have been really intense because there's so much in this book, and I do want to hold it up because everybody should, and I'll hold it up again. Hollywood Pride, you definitely want to go find this book. It's just fascinating. If you love movies and you love reading about the behind the scenes and all the things that have taken place, especially in the LGBTQ arena. And that's what this film is all about. So so tell me, how and why did you decide to write this book?
Well, it was pitched to me by Running Press, who they handle all of the books for Turner Classic Movies, and they put out, some really great ones at this point. And it's kind of in unofficially part of a series. They did one a few years back called Hollywood Black, that was a look at the history of Black performers and Black films coming out of the studio system. Then that followed with Viva Hollywood, which is about the Latine, same performers in films. And so now we're doing the LGBTQ plus one. And what was interesting about this is I think there have been books about the movies and sort of the evolution of, representations of LGBTQ plus characters and, how stories are told. And there have been films about the actual people behind the scenes, but this one, allowed a chance to really look at both.
And it does. So you lay this out really beautifully because you really start, in the early, the beginnings of the film industry and laying out the various Hollywood stars, and their sexual orientation and why it had to be kept a secret. So let's go into something. I mean, because there's so many, I don't even know which one to pick out because there's so many. Well, obviously, Cary Grant. We've heard this for years about his, relationship with Randolph Scott. And I'm a huge, like many people, were huge Cary Grant fans,
Me too. And and in the book, I pretty much try to make the case that we're never really gonna know.
It's true.
That there are people who talked about this aspect of their life in they wrote memoirs later or in their diaries or whatever. But there's a handful of folks. I kind of have one section. It's Cary Grant and Randolph Scott, Katharine Hepburn and Spencer Tracy, and Barbara Stanwyck. And the debate rages on. If you go to Barbara Stanwyck's Wikipedia page, the footnotes are a battlefield of people like, saying and counter saying and who knows. So at some point you have to be like, you know what, it's a mystery and it will always be a mystery. What we have that we can hang on to is the movies, and the movies themselves matter. And I think that the movies themselves lean, make these performers queer icons, whether they were queer or not. I think Cary Grant is very actively kind of tweaking the idea of masculinity in his films and what a leading man is and how a leading man behaves. Tracy and Scott both very much in the more kind of traditional tough guy mode, but always with kind of a sense of humor and always with kind of an observational tone of, not just sort of being, steeped in machismo all the time. And then, Hepburn and Stanwyck, strong women in a period where, like Hepburn had to fight the bosses at RKO just to wear pants. They didn't want her to. And in fact, I think they like stole her jeans out of her dressing room one day. And so she just went around not wearing anything until they finally relented and gave them back. So, this isn't, on the one hand, this isn't a book about gossip, but on the other hand, it's totally a book about gossip because when you're researching, the LGBTQ plus artists of the past, it's not like you're going to go dig up birth certificates or, land records or the usual things that people do in their doing histories. This is a thing that people, polite society didn't talk about. And if, you didn't express these things to people outside of the community and, you kept a lid on things. The historian William Mann has a great thing where he interviewed a lot of people who were survivors of that period. And he said, they didn't talk about being in the closet or out of the closet because out of the closet wasn't really an option. So the terms that everybody used were circumspect and overt.
Oh.
And so if you were George Cukor, you were circumspect. And if you were James Whale, you were overt. But even James Whale's overtness would be considered pretty circumspect by modern standards.
Well, we think that obviously every generation thinks that they've invented sex.
Exactly.
That, the sexual revolution happened in the 60s and, continues.
Before that, people only held hands,
Really, well, back in the 30s in Hollywood, oh my God. It's just,
for sure.
I mean, truthfully, I've been to the Hearst Castle numerous times, and you hear all the stories about what went on in the Hearst Castle. I just think that everybody was freewheeling. Maybe because they were coming out of, well, the Depression and,
World War One.
World
Yeah.
War One, and of course we had the Roaring Twenties, which was freewheeling in
Yeah.
its own. But I think people were just exploring their sexuality, which I think every generation does, and maybe many people do, and we're exploring. Hey, well, let's see what that might be like.
Yeah, no, I mean, here's the thing. LGBTQ plus people have always been around throughout history in every civilization on every corner of the globe. And it's just a matter of, did the society they live in champion them, allow them to live freely and openly, or did they, clamp down? And Hollywood, you kind of see the pendulum going back and forth. I mean, the way that I structure the book is that the very first one of the very first, sort of queer images on screen was in 1895, when you get the Dickinson experimental sound film, which has like the two men dancing together or somebody else is playing the violin, which was purely just a way to try and sync sound and picture. There was no queer intent to it, but it's nonetheless, a powerful image. That same year, Oscar Wilde gets, found guilty and sent to prison. And so I think from the dawn of cinema, you have this kind of clamping down on queerness that, like you have the law, you have the church, you have all these forces sort of being like, well, we can't, we shouldn't, we don't. And even though the nascent film industry in Hollywood, I'm sure, was a magnet for a lot of small town people who were like, you know what, there's nothing for me here, but I know how to make dresses, or I know how to, do whatever, and I'm going to go do it out there and probably meet other people like me. And so, there is a queer presence from the very dawn of cinema onward. And then, but like you said, the 30s, absolutely. On the one hand, there is a freewheeling nature to how society is coming off of the Roaring Twenties, even though people are clamping down a bit with the Depression and all. But the production code happens,
Oh, yes.
and the production code not only impacts how movies get made and what people can and can't say and can't do and can't show, but it carries over into real life, where suddenly stars are being told by the studios, you guys can't just shack up anymore, you have to get married, and you men have to marry a woman, and you women have to marry a man, and women can't wear slacks in public anymore, and all these sort of rules that get handed down to sort of present stars as being as wholesome as the movies they were now being forced to make were. But we never went away. It's just a matter of, we might have been hiding out in the 50s because of, the McCarthy hearings and being accused of communism. Certainly, in the 80s, when the AIDS epidemic hits and it becomes this very polarized community once again, we never go away. It's just a matter of how safe we feel in being open and talking about this stuff.
Well, obviously, we're more open about it now than we've ever been, and that was part of again, in the 60s we were marching for the rights of gays. I was part of that, and yet there's still a double standard in Hollywood, because even many of us have heard stories about, and I'm not, obviously I'm not going into any names or anything, but some famous actors,
Sure.
in particular, that, the rumors have been around and around and around for years that they're gay. And yet it would ruin their careers if they ever came out fully and said that. And that's sort of a shame, that's the case.
Yeah, I mean, the battle is not over. It's never over, and I mean, certainly now, for as much as the visibility that we have and the presence we have in the media, there is a very concerted effort from certain, quarters to really try and like quash the existence of trans people, and to even overturn gay marriage or whatever sort of meager victories we've had in the civil rights arena. And yeah, there is this notion of like, well, if you're a character actor or you're a song and dance man, yeah, sure, you can come out and whatever, it'll be fine. But if you are a, two-fisted He-Man action hero who's got the gal in one hand and a gun in the other, maybe we don't know if the public would accept that as much. So things are always improving, but we're always still fighting that battle.
Well, it's also interesting in how you wrote this, that the subtleties of queerness were in films.
Mhm.
That we did, that I was like, when I was reading, I was like, oh, I didn't really pick that up. I didn't even think about it in that way. And I wish I could give you something specific, because it happened in quite a few movies, obviously during the 30s and 40s. And with some of the actors that were in the films, maybe you can.
Yeah, I like, okay, famous example is Peter Lorre in The Maltese Falcon.
Yeah.
They never come out and say, oh, this character is gay, but when, before we even see him, like, the secretary hands Sam Spade, this calling card, and he smells it and he's like, oh, gardenia, and the music scores like, and then he comes in and he's got like the perm and the hand, the pinky sticking out, and he's like playing with his cane and bringing the handle up to his mouth, and it's like, okay, Peter Lorre, we get it, but that was the kind of, you had to sort of play those games during the production code era. You have Alfred Hitchcock making Rope, which is a film where you can never come out and say these two guys are gay, but like you watch the movie, you're like, well, yeah, those two guys are gay. Like there's no getting around it. So it is this thing of, there's a great quote from the great screenwriter J. Preston Allen, who wrote Cabaret, in the Celluloid Closet documentary, where she says, look, the guys who ran the code were not rocket scientists. If you were clever enough and subtle enough, you could get all kinds of things past them, and people did.
And it's too bad. I mean, when you go back to pre-code,
Yeah.
everybody loves the pre-code movies at the Classic Movie Film Festival. Those are the ones that everybody runs to. Oh, a pre-code film.
Saucy, yes.
Yes. And they were. They were. But yeah, the shift of what transpired obviously through the years. I mean, there's lots of movies we can talk about, but I do want to touch on, because they were heartthrobs, Tab Hunter and, obviously Rock Hudson and
Yeah.
Anthony Perkins, who I did meet a long time ago.
Oh, neat.
Yeah, years ago when he was doing a Broadway show. I want to say something about the tree, but I can't remember the name. But anyhow, but he got married and had children.
Yeah, and you know what? Bisexuality does exist. Like, let's not forget that, like, the people, contain multitudes, as Walt Whitman would say. So yes, Tony Perkins and Tab Hunter had a very passionate affair for quite some time.
I was surprised to hear that. I had never heard that before until I read it in your book. Yeah.
Oh yeah, Tab Hunter talks about it in his memoir, Tab Hunter Confidential, which was made into a really great documentary by Jeffrey Schwartz. I actually got to meet Tab Hunter once. I did a Q&A with him when that movie opened at the New Art here in Los Angeles. But yeah, so but they would go out with Natalie Wood or whatever sort of starlet the studio was hooking them up with, get their picture taken, drop the ladies off at home, and then go home together. But Perkins did fall in love with a woman, got married, had children. One of his sons is now a really great horror director, Osgood Perkins. But he had to sort of walk that line. And there's a really great, I didn't get into it much in the book, but if you watch there's a 4-part horror documentary on Shudder called Queer for Fear. And there's a lengthy conversation with Osgood Perkins about Psycho and about how there's a pattern that I bring up in the book of Hitchcock will deliberately cast gay actors in a way, in certain kinds of roles that allows them to be sort of discomforting figures, whether it's Robert Walker in Strangers on a Train, or like Ivor Novello back in The Lodger, at the very beginning of Hitchcock's career. And Norman Bates was the perfect role for Anthony Perkins, but so perfect that it kind of tainted the rest of his career, because before then he had been sort of a like sensitive romantic lead, and Norman Bates brought out the conflict within him in a way that I think audiences couldn't see him as anything else after that.
Right. And that's happened to other actors in other roles too. They've played them so well that they can't get work afterwards. At the Turner, I'll interrupt you a little bit, but during the Turner Classic Movie Film Festival, they showed Dirty Harry.
Yes,
And
well,
the actor, which I cannot remember his name, I'm so sorry, but he played the murderer so
oh,
well.
right. Yeah.
Couldn't get work for a number of years, and then the director that directed him in this movie took a chance on him in another role. But I mean,
Eric Roberts never recovered from Star 80. He's so good in that movie and so disturbing that I think it was casting agents just were like, yeah, that guy, and it's like he was doing a performance.
I know, and that's what's so bad. It's sad about someone who does such a good job, then they get penalized, for doing a good job afterwards. So Rock Hudson, we can't not talk about
Sure.
Rock Hudson because he did keep it a secret for
Very much so, yeah, for
his
decades.
entire life until he got AIDS, and
Yeah.
then so go ahead and tell us about that.
Yeah, so Hudson and Tab Hunter both were clients of this sort of infamous agent named Henry Wilson, who would take these kind of beefcake actors and give them new names and sort of shape their images. And he gave them, they did not come by Rock and Tab organically. They were named that by Henry Wilson, and Rock Hudson very quickly became Henry Wilson's like number one client to the point where like there's a confidential magazine, which was like this really tawdry gossip magazine from back in the day, that ran a story about Tab Hunter getting caught at an like all male pajama party or something. And rumor has it that Henry Wilson basically gave them that story so they wouldn't publish an even more damning story about Rock Hudson at the time. Um, and I think when Rock Hudson married briefly, the woman that he
Right.
married was like Henry Wilson's receptionist, basically.
I think that's what I
So
read. Yeah.
yeah, so that was all, it was all for show. And he, I think, was very comfortable with who he was, but it was, he was alive when he was alive, and we're all sort of a product of our era. He kind of understood what he was doing and what he had to do at that point to keep a career going. And so, yeah, it's not until the very end where it is, we're past the, oh, I have pneumonia story. It was like,
Right.
I have AIDS, he comes out then, and it's a big reverberation, both I think for a lot of people in the United States who had some idea of what a gay man was, and who also thought that AIDS was maybe never going to impact them at all or anyone that they ever knew. Suddenly here's this guy who they've grown up knowing and maybe being in love with, for most of their lives. It's like, oh wait, him. And that makes them, really kind of that creates a paradigm shift. It's sort of like later in reality TV when Pedro Zamora from The Real World came out on the show as being HIV positive, and then later passed away. I think Bill Clinton at the time said, well, like, everyone in America now knows someone who has died of AIDS because we had gotten to know him on that show. And so I think it was a similar thing for an older generation with Rock Hudson.
Yeah. And he did he helped the AIDS he helped it a lot. I mean, he helped shine a light on it, and as
Yeah.
you just said,
Uh,
in such a wonderful way that it changed the way people felt about
no,
AIDS, for sure.
Ronald Reagan did not say the word AIDS until after Rock Hudson died. And I mean, they were friends, and Hudson was a Republican and very supportive of the Reagans, and like had visited the White House and stuff, but could not get Nancy Reagan to make a call to get him into like, a hospital stateside. Like, just that's a very infuriating
Mm.
period of history for me. I came out in 1988, so I caught the tail end of it. But
Uh-huh.
it's a story, it's a history that I know well, and it still appalls me.
Yeah, well, it does. It still does. You're right. So let's move forward, because a movie that I love so much is Brokeback Mountain. I just love
Hmm.
that. I mean, every time I watch that, I just can't stop crying.
Yeah.
But I guess I haven't seen it in a little while. Maybe I'll watch it again after reading about it again in your book. But I loved that movie. So how did that? I mean, let's talk about how that actually changed the way people looked at a major love story on the screen with two straight actors playing
Right.
those characters beautifully. And so let's talk a little bit, do a little deeper dive into that story about Brokeback Mountain.
Sure. So yeah, this was, when it came out in 2005, it felt like a real paradigm shift. I mean, it was, we were already at a place where straight actors were not only not afraid to play queer roles, but kind of actively chasing them because, it was a good way to win awards. By that point, we'd had Tom Hanks in Philadelphia, we'd had William Hurt in Kiss of the Spider Woman. And so for a long time, straight actors didn't want to play gay because they thought like, would start rumors about them, whatever. And gay actors didn't want to play gay because they thought it was going to, shine a light on an aspect of their lives they were trying to keep hidden. But yeah, by the dawn of the 21st century, definitely you've got straight actors looking for these kinds of roles. And this is a film that went through a very complicated production history. I mean, like Diana Osana and Larry McMurtry, scooped up the rights to the short story. But so many, like Gus Van Sant was going to direct it at some point, and all these different actors were attached to it. And so you finally wind up with Ang Lee, who, while not American, definitely, he'd come off of doing Sense and Sensibility, and he's not British either, but he understands repression and he understands, you know, love that is forbidden by society, basically, and I think, he's Taiwanese, they have their own history with that kind of thing. And so, he winds up being the perfect choice to do it. You've got, Heath Ledger and Jake Gyllenhaal killing it, and Anne Hathaway and Michelle Williams as their spouses. So, it's a great film. And what really crossed that movie over, I think, for a lot of people, that it didn't just become like a big city movie or an art house movie, but was a hit, like was seen around the country. Like my husband took his mom to see it in Texas and at a matinee, and he was like, he couldn't believe how many people were there. Like all these old couples had gone to see Brokeback Mountain. I relate it to the impact that Uncle Tom's Cabin had when it came out. I think when that book was published in the late 19th century, for a lot of white readers, it was like, oh, that's what's going on. That's what slavery is actually like. Whether or not that book is fully accurate, it gave them a window into a world about which they knew nothing. And I think that for a lot of straight audiences, Brokeback Mountain was the first time that they kind of stopped and realized, oh, there is a price to homophobia. Like my attitudes aren't just about, who I don't want to have in my house, but they're actively messing up other people's lives. They're actively creating tragedy for other people who don't get to live their lives or be with the person that they love the most, and it didn't, fix the world, but I think for a lot of people, it was sort of a first step of even acknowledging that this is going on, and that people's bigotry doesn't exist in a vacuum, that it has repercussions, and there is a ripple effect into how it impacts people that you might actually know and care about, And so I think that's why that movie resonated, the way that it did. And I was working at the Advocate, the national LGBTQ news magazine, and there was a real sense of excitement, like, oh, this movie did really well. This movie is an awards magnet. Like we're here come the floodgates are going to open. We're going to see a lot because Hollywood loves to borrow and rehash and rip off and like glom onto something that's popular. Here we come. It's gonna and then no, of course not. Nothing happened because when a queer film does well, or a film aimed at women, or a film aimed at like, black audiences, like makes money and is a hit, those all become a fluke somehow. Whereas like, straightforward kind of like white guy dramas or actions or whatever, action movies, if one of them doesn't do well, we'll just, the next one will, but if something like Brokeback Mountain breaks through, well, that it happened that one time, but we're not gonna, we're not gonna hitch our wagon to that star.
No, they probably thought, well, that movie was so amazingly well done and beautiful that how could they possibly
Oh, but that doesn't
stop
stop
it?
them. I mean, Jaws was great, but that didn't keep them
Yeah,
from trying to make 20, inferior versions.
I know, and it's the same thing with all the. I think we're done with the. I think we've had DC comic fatigue and the rest of it too. I think we're all like, okay, we've seen it, we've done it. I don't know any more of these characters you can keep, creating. But anyhow, this book is such a fascinating book.
Thank you.
It really is, and it doesn't. I mean, anybody who just loves movies, this is just a great book about, but particularly about this history in Hollywood, which is so key and so important because movies have such uh, they can change the way we think about things. Movies are movements and can become
Absolutely.
movements. And it's so key and so important to have these kinds of films out there for everyone to see and to open us all up. Bottom line, we're all human beings. You know?
And I think also, I think it's interesting to note that so many of the non-gay films that you've loved over the years are were created in different ways by, queer artists, whether
Oh,
it's,
yeah.
George Cukor making the Philadelphia Story, or, James Crabe, who was part of a sort of a loose film collective in the 1960s called the Gay Girls Writing Club that would make these very campy short films. He goes on to be the cinematographer of, Rocky and the Karate Kid. So,
Yeah. So
I think the contributions to cinema go beyond just queer film to like film in general.
exactly, exactly. Yeah. So well, our time is up, Alonso. This
Oh,
has been so fun and such a great time. I'm gonna hold the book up again.
thank you.
And where can people buy Hollywood Pride?
Wherever books are sold, it is out there in the world.
Just
If you
in
want
time
to,
for Pride Month too, by the
that's
way.
yes.
June is Pride Month. If everybody doesn't know that.
Pride should be a
So
gift giving occasion, I think, and this would be
yeah,
a
well,
lovely.
Father's Day,
Yeah, no, 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 absolutely, no argument there. Yeah, it's the first time that something I've written is a book and an ebook and an audio book, which I recorded. So all those things are out there. Ask at your local bookstore. Ask your local library. If your library uses the Libby app, you can request to check out the ebook or the audio book, and if they don't have them, make that request and maybe they'll get it.
Great. Thank you so much. Everybody look for Hollywood Pride. Thank you, Alonso, for being on the show. Fascinating conversation. I really
Thanks,
appreciate
Jan.
it. You have a
Appreciate it.
great day. Thank you so much.
You too.
Thank you.
Take care.